So I'm Dustyn Roberts, and this is Catarina Mota. Like Sabrina said, we were both the co-chairs of the Open Hardware Summit that just happened on Thursday.
Okay, it might be this one that I'm holding. Okay, I'm going to try this. We're going to talk briefly about where we are at right now with open source hardware, but mostly about how we got here, because we believe that it's really important to understand how things happen and how they come together in order to get a better grasp of where we are and where we might be going. So just going back to the very basics, open source hardware is a production mode in which all the plans necessary to reproduce a device are made available online under a license that allows anyone to copy, modify, and redistribute the device. So what this is doing is that it's like the fact that the plans are available is allowing people from all walks of life and all ages to start creating, hacking, and repurposing hardware. So now we're going to go a little bit over, we're going to go back to the beginning, over 10 years ago, and see how this all started and how we got here. Do you want to?
So open hardware really started in the late 1990s or so, and at this point Linux was a big thing, and it's an open source software operating system. And the programmers figured that it would be easier for them to write open source software if they had open source hardware to do this with, because a lot of the hardware was still kind of a black box. So when they started creating their own open source hardware, they ended up publishing the plans and sharing it with each other, and it was just kind of no big deal. It's just how they worked. And that's how open source hardware really started. There was no big fanfare, no parade, just what people started doing. And one of the oldest open hardware projects and oldest communities now is a project called Open Cores, where they were first developing the first open cores and shared the plans and shared the hardware schematics online, and they are still in existence today.
Which one? I'm confused. Oh, the right one. Okay. So another very early project was SparkFun. SparkFun is currently an electronics kit store. And it started about in 2003. Nathan, the CEO and founder, was in college at the time, and he was working on, I can't remember exactly what it was, but he was having a really hard time sourcing parts for his project. Eventually, he realized that if you bought a bigger quantity, then he could keep for himself just the few that he needed, and he could sell the rest to his friends, and that's how SparkFun started in his dorm room. Eventually, the company took off. He was really taken by surprise with that. Within just a few months, he was getting orders from France and from all over the world. And right now, they have reported a revenue of over $20 million for 2011. So it's a really big company. They have 135 employees. And they went beyond just selling the raw parts to actually having their own kits and other things like that. So also, shortly after this, in 2004, appeared another really, really important project for open source hardware, and that was the RepRap. So the RepRap was started by Adrian Boyer, who is a professor at University of Bath in the UK. And he basically wanted to build a self-replicating machine. And that's what the RepRap was designed to do. It does print some of its parts. In terms of volume, it's most of its parts, but there's still quite a few components of the machine that are not printable. But so what is interesting is Adrian's perspective on why he open sourced the machine. I talked to him several years ago, and he sent me he has a really great sense of humor, so he sent me a really, really funny email in which he said, because I created a self-replicating device, I had no choice but to open source it. Otherwise, I would spend the rest of my life in court trying to prevent people from doing the very thing the machine was designed to do. RepRap is actually, so that I said 2004, so it's one of the oldest projects again, and it has been playing a very, very important role in the current state of open source hardware. So as soon as Adrian launched the project, he also put out a call for developers. Because it was open source, he wanted to be also developed around the world by different people. So around that time, that's when people started creating the first 3D printers in their garages.
So how many of you have subscriptions to Make magazine or have ever read one? Great. So you're at Maker Faire, you all know that, and Make magazine came out around 2005, and the first Maker Faire was a few years after that. And aside from bringing together all these people in one place and having an audience for this magazine, it really gave a place and a name to the different people tinkering in their garages and their apartments and trying out little projects and this and that. All of a sudden, we were all makers. And that community has grown and grown exponentially almost over the last few years. And Maker Faire started out with 10,000, 20,000, and now over 100,000 people in San Mateo, California, and now there's the New York Maker Faire, and there's Maker Fairs all over the world now, mini Maker Fairs, over 60 of them now, and just hundreds of thousands of people are attending these every year. So creating these ties is a really important function that Make served, and many of the participants in Make magazine and in Maker Faire participate in the open hardware community and use open hardware like Arduinos and things like that to function, to make their projects function and to run their projects. Then speaking of Arduinos, has anyone here ever played with an Arduino? You know what that was? Great. So Arduinos are little kind of $30 microprocessors that act as the brains of a lot of open hardware projects, and it's an open hardware project in and of itself. So you can go online and download all the software that you need to run it, all the hardware that you need to make your own if you wanted to. And if you want to just learn about what the schematic for something looks like for a board like this, you can go in and dive in and look at all the files on your own. It started in 2005 when a team of educators from an institute in Italy decided they needed a platform to teach their students better, and they didn't have one that was accessible, low cost enough to do this. So they created Arduino, and they named it after the local pub. The pub's name was Arduino. And since then, it's become basically a building block and sold over 300,000 versions of them. And those are just the Arduino trademarked versions. There's all kinds of DIY Arduino clone type things that are sanctioned and unsanctioned on different markets. And it spreads farther and faster than any other microcontroller project before it. And part of the reason we think that is because it's open hardware. And you can learn, and it created this amazing community around it.
So by the end of the decade, going back to the RepRap project, the project was still very much alive, but progress was pretty slow. And I think that the main reason why this was happening is because even though the plans were available, it was extremely hard to source the right parts. It depended very much on where in the world you were and what you could obtain. You know, if you can obtain like Acme threaded rod, that would be a big problem, and your machine would have several problems after that. So that's when, realizing this, 3 members of our hackerspace of NIC Resistor decided to redesign or design a new machine based on the RepRap, putting aside the goal of self-fabrication. So that's how the MakerBot Cupcake CNC was born. Understanding that their goal was also to share this as much as possible, to put 3D printers in the hands of as many people as possible, they created a company around it and started selling the kits. So suddenly, it has allowed the technology to really take off, because now not only the plans were online, but it was extremely easy to obtain the parts and assemble them. So MakerBot played a very important role in these initial years. But then very shortly after that, like within just a few months and years, we started seeing other projects in the same area, such as LaserSaw, an open source laser cutter, DIY Little CNC, an open source CNC, Ultimaker, another open source 3D printer, and these are just a few. And these are available in, a wide array of formats, from just, the plans where you have to source the parts, to the kits, to assembled machines.
So, and after that, we saw a kind of explosion in open hardware companies from 8 different industries here in New York. We have DIY Drones that makes unmanned aerial vehicles. That's also open hardware. We have Bug Labs, Dangerous Prototypes, EvilMed Scientist Labs, Seed Studio, Maker Plane, Beagleboard, and just a whole, and I feel like I hear of a new one every couple of weeks. So a lot of these companies are sharing not only their products, but also their kind of plans for success as a business. So it's become a huge community that we just got to be a part of a few days ago at the Open Hardware Summit. And, and we've seen this community grow and change, and there's kind of companies popping up in every little niche of this open hardware community, feeding the makers as well.
The science.
Yeah. And so, and not only are we seeing kind of electronics kits, but we are seeing more things like in new frontiers, maybe we call it, in biomedical engineering type fields, where you have an open source heart rate monitor here pictured. And this picture in the middle here, that's actually a cockroach, which with a printed circuit board on the back of it that was done a live demoed on this past Thursday. And that's from Backyard Brains, where they're open sourcing research tools and teaching kids and adults more about neuroscience based on open hardware. And we also have all kinds of open source textile sensors that you see over here, where you can squeeze and pull and stretch different kinds of fabrics that have conductive threads or conductive fabrics in them, and they work similarly to flexible circuit boards.
So at this point, we already covered like two of the main ingredients of the state of open source hardware. So the hardware itself, the open source itself, the tools, the 3D printers, laser cutters, and CNCs that are necessary to fabricate the objects based on the plans. And then the third ingredient are the people. And those come into the picture mostly through hackerspaces. So around 2006, Nick Faire, who's a pretty awesome hacker, was invited to Berlin, and he visited one of the earliest hackerspaces there called C-Based. He was so impressed that he came back, he, organized a group, and everyone got on a plane to go visit Germany and check out hackerspaces. The trip was called Hackers on a Plane. So within 2 weeks of that group coming back to the state, they founded, if I'm not mistaken, 5 hackerspaces. So NYC Resistor here in New York, Noisebridge in San Francisco, Hacktory in Philadelphia, and HackDC in Washington, D.C. And then within just the 2 years, the hackerspace movement spread like wildfire. And right now, hackerspaces.org registers around 500 spaces around the world, anywhere from Bangalore, Saigon, Moscow, Hong Kong, Beijing, Shanghai, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, Lagos, New Delhi, Nepal, Singapore, and these are just the ones I wrote down.
Right. So by around 2010, the community had grown so much that a lot of members felt it was necessary to start to kind of formalize more of the vocabulary and terminology around open source hardware, so we could better identify what was an open hardware project and what wasn't. And right around that time in 2010, Aya Badir, who was at that time a Creative Commons fellow, was trying to turn her project Little Bits into a company. And they're actually right outside here in the makerspace next to NYC Resistor if you want to visit their tent later. So she got together a group of people you see here in the picture, about 25 people, all involved in open hardware, from Arduino to open source prosthetics to legal counsel from Creative Commons, to kind of talk about what it meant and how we could kind of protect this sharing and community going forward. So what happened is during this session, there was a lot of kind of legal coaching going on about what you can and can't do, and what happens when you start just sharing things and what kind of protections you can expect. And one of the things that came out of this was the open hardware definition, where dozens of community members kind of voted in, and this initial working group developed this definition, and then it was put online, and anyone from the community could kind of sign up and edit it and help shape this definition. So this wasn't one person saying this is what open hardware is, the community itself made the definition of the term kind of by and for itself.
So also in early 2010, Alicia Gibb, who was then director of R&D at Bug Labs, which is another company that produces open source hardware, began organizing the first Open Hardware Summit. So for the same reasons that the community felt that it was time to get together and start defining things better, we also felt there was time to have a platform, a venue to get together and talk about how to make open source hardware, how to make it better. So that's how the first Open Hardware Summit came to be. It took place in September 2010, and almost 400 people came. And it became an annual event since then. We just had the third edition 2 days ago. 2 days ago.
So after this creation of the Open Hardware Summit, the Open Hardware Open Source Hardware Association was born, actually just a few months ago. So after the community created the definition, then we have the community that created the summit, and then we have the community that created this open source hardware association. Because when people ask things like, well, what's the best way to get started as an open source hardware business? There was no organization to kind of have an FAQ list on their website to kind of be the umbrella organization to serve the community. So Alicia Gibbs is acting as the president currently of the Open Source Hardware Association, and is served by a board made up of members from the community, all the way from lawyers to CEOs of the companies to academics, to help advise this association going forward. And like we said, we just finished co-chairing the 3rd annual Open Hardware Summit this past Thursday, and it's been really, really interesting to see how the community has grown up over the last 3 years. There's hundreds and hundreds of people now employed in open source hardware businesses. A lot of them are doing very well, and some of them are facing challenges. And there's a lot of people more and more interested in learning more and more because of open source hardware and supporting it. And at first we were concerned about when and if we would finish selling enough tickets to cover the summit. And then about a month before the summit, we sold out, and then we had to spend a month figuring out how to say no politely to people, because we really were getting requests from all over the world, and we were just completely sold out and booked. So it was very, very encouraging, not only from attendees and speakers, but also sponsors, that there's a lot of people, and press, that there was a lot of people interested in this movement and what everyone is doing and how it's growing.
So now we are arrived at a sort of a crossroads, or a moment when we have to make some decisions. On the one hand, the community is growing immensely in all directions. Open source hardware is being applied not just for gadgets in business, it's being used for making actual science, it's being used for education, art, design. It's just like textiles, wearables, all these things. And at the same time, our diversity is increasing. We're also having to make difficult choices. So then we were looking at this panorama, and we've been looking at this time frame, and looking at how, at this Venn diagram that we do have up. And so the really hard thing of open source hardware, and the thing that people keep bringing up, is like, we're doing this for the first time. We have nothing to reference. We have nothing to look up to. We're making it up as we go. So we tried to look a little bit at the history of open source itself, and at the history of technology, because open source is a lot older than any of this, and found an interesting parallel, which was the creation of the personal computer back in the 70s. So looking at this, we have digital fabricators now. So that's our revolutionary technology. They had the personal computer then. So we have two technologies with the same potential to change the world. We have open source hardware and open source software now. They didn't call it that back then, but that's what they had. That's what they did. People exchanged programs freely. They exchanged schematics freely. We have hacker spaces, and they had the Homebrew Computer Club, which was, for all purposes, in effect, a sort of a hacker space. So now, looking at that, let's see how that unfolded. So it all, like, the personal computer was developed in just 2 years. We went from mainframes to actual personal computers. And this happened, and everyone who was involved says this happened because of collaboration, because people were sharing so much information that none of them had to reinvent the wheel. Of course, there was a business opportunity here, and companies appeared almost immediately. But still, the CEOs and founders of those companies were members of the Homebrew Computer Club. And after the meetings, not only they would share a lot of information during the meetings, but they would go to this burger joint around the corner to drink beer and eat burgers and fries. And they were competitors, right? They were selling the same product, but they would share information because they knew that that was the only way they could develop it fast enough. So we went from this atmosphere where everyone was sharing information and helping each other out, and all the companies are growing, but within just 2 years that changed radically. Apple came out of this. So basically, Steve Wozniak designed his first personal computer, his Apple II, at the Homebrew Computer Club. And then he was joined by Steve Jobs, who was essentially a really good businessman. So he said, let's turn this into a business. He brought in people to do that, and they created a company for that. And then eventually they were forced to pull out of the Homebrew Computer Club because they could no longer share information. And so did many of the other companies. And now, I think that the rest is history. Almost all the businesses that came out of the Homebrew are now not only closed source, but don't even dare unbolting that computer. I was just at the Apple store yesterday, and I had a really interesting discussion when I tried to actually open one of the computers that I had bought already. They didn't let me do it in the store. So Dustyn is going to wrap it up for us with, I think, a really interesting analogy.
So has anyone ever read a Choose Your Own Adventure book? So we think we're at a kind of point where we get to choose our own adventure here. So do we go the way of Apple and get thousands of patents on things and argue with lawyers, or do we continue on the path of open hardware and figure out a way to share and grow and help everybody together? So we have a real opportunity to enable people around the world and also raise the general level of technology literacy, because open hardware allows you to kind of dive in and share and kind of stop looking behind your back and just accept things when you don't know them and ask questions, and then learn from people who have come before you, and then post what you learn online so other people can learn from you. And being part of that community, we feel, is stronger than shutting people out of that kind of information. So it'll be really interesting to see, and we hope you all choose our adventure in the open side of the fence, and that's what we're kind of here to talk about today. So
yay, open source.
This is a picture of our hackerspace from several years ago. Our hackerspace NYC Resistor also has a booth here, and we just turned 5 years old. So we're happy to, we hold classes there, and a lot of the participants helped out with the Open Hardware Summit a few days ago. So it's a great place for people capital to help with this.
So I think we're out of time, but we're going to hang out outside if anyone wants to talk about this, okay? Thank you so much for listening.